The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. I'm Ashley Fahey, managing editor of the Charlotte Ledger. To find out more about the Charlotte Ledger, visit thecharlotteledger.com. I'm joined today by John Short, a freelance writer and co-host of the Charlotte Podcast, who writes stories about Charlotte's history for the Charlotte Ledger. Today, we're talking about his latest series for the Ledger, Love Thy Neighborhood, which examines the history of some of Charlotte's oldest neighborhoods. We talk about why learning about a neighborhood's history can give us a blueprint for its future. So thank you for joining us today, John. Really appreciate it. You've been a common byline in the Charlotte Ledger for especially a lot of your historical pieces, but I'd love for you to kind of just start out here by telling us a little bit about yourself and your history.
Yeah, sure. So I am not a Charlotte native, but I've lived here for 16 years, and it's become home. I grew up in the Northern Virginia area where history is everywhere in a way, and very obvious in a way that it's not necessarily in Charlotte. So I grew up, my high school conference was called the Battlefield District growing up because of all the Civil War and Revolutionary battlefields that are around where I grew up. Field trips were always to historic places. So reflecting in adulthood on kind of why I was interested in history is because of that. I grew up with history all around me. And since I've been in Charlotte, always curious, not seeing an old town necessarily like what I was used to, kind of started digging in on my own around what is the story of this place? Like where I see the markers and the Liberty Walk in Uptown and things like that, and just kind of digging a little bit, and only to find that there's actually a lot of really interesting stories. While it might not be as present in the built environment, things like the mech deck and Civil War history and even presidential visits and kind of how the city, and I'm sure we'll talk about more, kind of how Charlotte is an interesting example and blueprint of American history and how things developed and urban areas developed over the years. So seems like everywhere, once you're in that mode of discovering the stories of the city, there's kind of something around every corner, and been able to do that and have the opportunity to kind of like share some of those interesting stories, whether it be people through historical heavyweights or now neighborhoods in the series that is in the Ledger, telling the stories of the places that we all live now and how they've changed over the years and what their origins were. So that's kind of the 2 minutes on my own interest and where it's going.
Awesome. And is history a hobby for you, or do you have a professional background? We won't disqualify you if you don't, but just curious.
I would not call myself a historian, very much an amateur in all of this. I think my bona fides are just that I'm curious, I think. And you start looking into things and riding on the backs of people that are historians. So Tom Hanchett and lots of folks that have written about the story of Charlotte have done a great job of kind of summarizing that stuff. And those things are things I enjoy sinking my teeth into. And there's a lot of folks in the community that have done the legwork of investigating these stories. And I think what I enjoy about it, and probably as much as I have a skill set to bring to it, is kind of like tying those things together and creating a narrative. Because a lot of that's what's missing, I think, in Charlotte. Is it's not that there isn't history here. It's that it's not consumable in a narrative way that ties into the American history that we all grew up learning in school. And being able to tie those things together and make Charlotte part of that fabric is something that's really interesting to me, and fortunate to have the opportunity to talk about in the Ledger.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's something I always wonder about. Charlotte has this reputation for not having history or erasing its history. And it's kind of almost become a joke at this point that where's all the history in Charlotte? But
Right.
As your series, and like you mentioned, Tom Hanchett and other folks have proven, like there is a lot of history here. Maybe that story just hasn't been told. Do you have any thoughts about why people have this perception that Charlotte doesn't have a lot of history or is really bad about preserving it?
Yeah, I think something that is inherent in Charlotte is kind of this culture of striving and growth, and through frankly an American capitalist lens of there's always more to grow and strive towards. And that often has come at the expense of the history and built environment and the places that were. I think you can debate about whether that's kind of good or bad, but the reality is in 2026, that's kind of how we've gotten to this point. Is a lot of the old places, good and bad, and old structures in Uptown have been torn down to make way for what is new. And there's a pro and con of that, right? And I think all of us, one of the reasons that it's important to understand the history and the stories of where you come from is for preservation and recognizing that, hey, the things that might have different value now, maybe someday we would want to preserve those. So it's important to always keep that in mind, I think, like as we have this culture of kind of growth and more, and what does the Charlotte of the future look like? Like, hey, because there's important things that happened in the past, like maybe we'll feel the same way in the future. I think that's kind of inherent in Charlotte. Like I'm fond of saying, maybe this can start off some of the history discourse, but I'm fond of saying that the soul of Charlotte, why Charlotte is the way it is, has always been the same, which is people from mostly other places looking for a place with good weather, lower cost of living to raise their family and have a stable job and enjoy a great economy and a great place to live. And it's kind of been that way for 270 plus years.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to think about it because, to your point, in the modern context, you talk about these things, but I'm sure these themes have been relevant through history. Maybe to start off, though, I'd love to talk a little bit about historical heavyweights. You've done that series now for a few years for the Ledger, and I know I've been intrigued to learn about some of the names behind, or some of the history behind the names we see a lot in Charlotte. But can you just tell us a little bit about that project and what got you interested in it?
Yeah, sure. I think going back to talk about my curiosity and learning about the city, I think there's a lot of really interesting figures that are local historical celebrities. I call them, at least. And you see them oftentimes, they're enshrined with statues here and there around Uptown as part of that series, or maybe there's a plaque about them in Uptown. And those are kind of the founding fathers of Charlotte. So like Thomas Polk, Thomas Spratt, King Hagler, we've written about in the historical heavyweight series. But as you scratch the surface, there's these really interesting, compelling stories of, like, frankly, the celebrities of Charlotte in the past that aren't as well known. A good example of that I love telling people about is Dr. Annie Alexander, who was the first licensed female physician in the state of North Carolina. She lived in and practiced in Uptown, right on 7th Street, like right where Duckworth's in 7th Street is. She kind of had a practice right across the street and would make house calls, and was this woman whose father was a physician and had his own personal experiences like treating women, and was kind of like from an early age, she was molded to become a physician for women in Charlotte. And I think that's like a really fascinating story, like frankly, something that we should all be proud of that happened in our backyard. And being able to highlight stories like that is something that always energizes me as I find somebody new that has left their fingerprints on Charlotte that maybe aren't as obvious as you walk around and look up at the buildings, but the stories were there and they kind of walk the same streets and everything. So kind of like highlighting that is something that's been exciting to be able to write about in this historical heavyweight series.
Yeah, so now you've got your new series called Love Thy Neighborhood, which is kind of doing the same thing, looking at the history of place versus people, especially neighborhoods specifically. And I always thought this was a really cool idea when you came and pitched it to us, because I'm someone who loves walking a neighborhood. I'm someone who's covered growth here for so long, and I think neighborhood identity is such a core thing in Charlotte, as it is with most cities. But what kind of spurred you to want to look into this and kind of dig into the history of specific neighborhoods?
Yeah, it's interesting because doing the historical heavyweight series, you go deep on these people, and especially in kind of turn of the century folks and the founding fathers, like the story's pretty much the same, where they lived in rural area of South Carolina or North Carolina and moved to an economic center, probably typically went up north to be educated, and then kind of made their impact in whatever area it was in the city. So they had that impact, and some of them, like we said, are recognizable names. But where all of these folks practiced and left their impact on the city, other things sprouted up. Whenever I was investigating these individuals, they were part of a community fabric that had its own story to tell when I was looking into it. So it's really interesting to look at somebody like Thaddeus Tate, who was a leader during kind of like the Jim Crow era of the South and Charlotte, and was involved in the Mecklenburg Investment Corporation buildings that's still in Uptown. And that's the story. You can tell his story, which is fascinating, kind of how he was a community leader. But he represented the Brooklyn neighborhood of Charlotte. And that has its own like rich story with other characters as well. And in that particular case, kind of there's still some of that old built environment buildings are still there, and something that you can see and experience and kind of consider that story, even though it's 106 years old now. And those buildings, those stories, those communities that were there are still around today. And you can, again, walk those same streets and see what they've become. And so in a way, you have kind of the people that made the places, but the places themselves have their own story to tell as well. And it's also a little bit more real when you can go and visit these places and kind of see what they've become, see the old with the new, see where typically more often than not, like where the old used to be and what's in its place. But I'd like to think that it gives you an appreciation for, again, kind of what we all as Charlotteans are building now, and kind of what the opinions of that will be in the future as well. So the more you understand where you've been, it can kind of help chart the path forward of those communities in a growing place like Charlotte that's kind of always growing and rewriting what the future is going to look like.
And when you talk to folks about neighborhoods, are you finding that people want to know that history? Is there still interest in knowing, what happened here in this neighborhood 100 years ago for the neighborhoods that have been around that long?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you probably experienced this as well, talking to folks. And sometimes it's just like dropping a nugget about like, hey, this place used to be a drugstore back in the day, right? Or like, oh, you see that old faded painting on that wall? That was because it was a barbershop before it's now like a Mexican place or whatever, right? People love hearing about that stuff. I think because, like we talked about before, there's a lot of attitude and opinion that there is no history in Charlotte, and it's very easy to dismiss. And I don't blame people for not being immediately aware and curious and wanting to learn more, because it isn't obvious. But I find almost to a person, when you're able to open that door a little bit to the past and say, actually, did you know this used to be this thing? Or did you know that this author, one of my favorite stories is Carson McCullers was a celebrity, like bona fide, like national celebrity who wrote The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. There's a historical heavyweights on her. She briefly, for a time, lived in Charlotte in what is now the Copper restaurant on East Boulevard. Like, people love hearing that. A lot of people you talk to, like, they've been to Copper, they're at least familiar with the building. They're like, what? Like, a award-winning novelist like wrote her first novel while staying at the house that is now Copper. Like, that's pretty cool. I like knowing about that. There's a lot of energy when you share just frankly trivia nuggets sometimes, but it can lead to a broader curiosity of like, oh, well, that's why that street is that way, or that's why this landmark that I walk past all the time has historical significance and meaning, and people like feeling connected to those stories, and it helps them kind of better understand this place that often they have moved to from somewhere else, and helps them feel more connected to the place that they're in now and calling home.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When you know a bit about the history, especially of a specific building like Copper, what is present day Copper, I think you just have a greater appreciation for that neighborhood and that history and maybe the city that you live in. You've done one piece so far, Eastover, and another one is coming out this month on Grier Heights. What do you think about when you try to decide which neighborhoods to profile? There's a lot of neighborhoods with different history. Some go back over a century, I would think, and then others are a little more contemporary. So how do you kind of decide who to profile or what neighborhood to profile?
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge. Like, I geek out on this stuff. So the hard part is deciding which ones to do first. So you mentioned Eastover is the first one. I chose that one because I drive by it all the time. It's kind of close to where I live. And I think you can't help but notice when you drive through Eastover that it just feels a little bit different. Obviously, like beautiful homes and big manicured lawns and all of that. But it begs the question, like, man, like, how did this become like an enclave for like these grand homes? And to the point earlier about tying it into like a broader tapestry of American history is like, well, that's because unlike places like Dilworth and Elizabeth that were the original streetcar suburbs, Eastover was actually the first automobile suburb that was built in Charlotte. So a lot of the very boring things of kind of residential land development that we kind of take for granted now were intentionally created and put in practice because of the kind of thinking at the time and where Charlotte was as a city is like, hey, we want to have a place for people who are driving rather than riding a streetcar and public transportation to access not just their jobs in, at the time, downtown, but also kind of where they go around here. They were excited to have cars and be able to use their cars and have that be the foundation of their family life. So they built estates and homes that had driveways and had curving, meandering boulevards, really, that could cut through hills in a way that a streetcar couldn't. When you dig into it and learn more about places like that, you're like, oh man, so that's why this is the way it is. That's why this place feels different, is because of things like the adoption of the automobile as something every family had, or every wealthy family had in Charlotte, led to the creation of this place that was for the use of this new technology, frankly. So it's another point too, and kind of pulling that thread a little bit on why I think it's important and interesting is you think about the adoption of technology in a society and how that changes the built environment around us, like a streetcar suburb. On the heels of COVID, people were moving and remote work became more popular, right? So people changed the way their homes were designed in order to accommodate an office and things like that. So those kind of broad sweeping changes that affect all of us as Americans and society kind of have a microcosm of that impact in Charlotte. And learning about those things and bringing that to the forefront is something I seek to do in the neighborhood series and kind of helping this place in the history of Charlotte come alive.
Yeah, and I think to your point, and you put this so well, is it informs so much about how we plan the city of the future, how we plan for Charlotte's growth, how we plan for our infrastructure. You know, when I walk with folks in my neighborhood series, Neighborhood Walk, a lot of things come up around traffic, around density, around, we want to preserve our neighborhood's character. And all these things kind of have to work in tandem with the history and understanding why the roads developed the way they did, why the homes developed the way they did. And I don't know that everyone fully understands that history all the time. So it's always interesting to me when I talk to folks today about where we're going as a city. A lot of it is informed, to your point, by what has happened over so many decades. And I don't know. I just think that's completely interesting. I know, you're going to have your next piece coming out about Grier Heights.
Yeah.
Can you just give us a little sneak peek about something you discovered and where that is?
Grier Heights, if you're not familiar with the location of it, is down Monroe Road on the east side of town, just east of Elizabeth, on where 7th Street turns into Monroe. That was an easy one to put high on the list of neighborhoods to write about, because I think it has a fascinating story that's really unique to Charlotte and something that a lot of people don't know, even that live in the area, and something to be celebrated. The story there is the founder of the area was actually a emancipated former slave who set out on his own and got permission to buy 100 acres of farmland to create a community for other Black families to live and own and cultivate and kind of live their lives like on the outskirts of the city at the time. So Sam Billings was his name. And so Billingsville, you may have heard that. There's kind of the Billingsville roads and fields and an elementary school around there is just like a fascinating story that a lot of us just like drive past all the time unaware of. This happened kind of in the Jim Crow South, like early 1900s. And the fact he was able to do that, able to kind of work with the landowners and the cities to establish that and create this enclave to frankly live the American dream as it could be in that context, is really, I find, like an inspiring story. And I think to the point about having the past informing today, I think when you think about topics like gentrification and just real estate turnover and housing affordability and all of those things, like really, like that's what the story was 150 years ago. And Sam Billings set out to solve that problem in the way that he knew how. And the homes that now sit there are part of that story as well. And that's something to consider when you're tackling the problems of today, right? Like there's a bigger story than just like the structure that is sitting on a piece of land and kind of the folks moving in. Like you're kind of moving into being part of this tapestry of history that goes back, in this case, like a century. Like very few things in Charlotte go back a century. This does, and that it's kind of important to consider, again, like while you're thinking about the headline topic of today. There's also a Rosenwald School, if you're familiar with that program. So for those not familiar, there's a program around the same time period in the 1920s. The Rosenwald schools were these schools that were built throughout the country that were designed to be schoolhouses for elementary education for the Black population, for Black children to become educated. The facilities just were not made available, were not there for kind of Jim Crow reasons in the South. And this was, we would describe it today as kind of a nonprofit and public-private partnership in order to build those structures. So the Grier Heights neighborhood actually still has one of those structures today that was a Rosenwald school. So I think that's another part of this really compelling history that is, again, in the built environment. You can go see it today. Ties to the story of Sam Billings and Billingsville and this concept that is part of all of our history as Charlotteans and exists today. So that was an easy one to want to write about early, just because like there's so much fascinating history that if you just kind of care to look around, these stories are out there.
Yeah, it sounds like, to your point, there's so many lessons learned in the past and learning from our history. Do you think if there was a greater awareness about some of our neighborhood histories, maybe some of the people that made Charlotte's history, or maybe the underreported on stories here, if there was more awareness about these histories, would that make us decision makers and leaders here make better decisions? Or how do you think that influences how we think about the future?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts on that. Like one is that, yeah, I think when it comes to understanding in a place like we touched on before, like the story of Charlotte is the story of kind of commerce and business and determining the highest and best use of the resources and assets of the region, right? It's very capitalistic. And I don't mean that in like a negative way at all. I think it is, like it or not, it's a story of like Mecklenburg County and North Carolina. But understanding the story and from where all of this came from is something, a bit of a counterbalance when you're considering what is the highest and best use of this area. You need to have on the other side of the scale of whatever you think the future could look like, the other side of the scale should be weighted a little more heavily with the stories of kind of what came before in this case, in like land use and development and all of that. But in general, about Charlotte and all of the resources that we have, like people didn't move here for the first time in the 1970s, right? Even though it feels that way sometimes when you look at the skyscrapers in Uptown. And weighing that, being aware of that, being aware of the stories of the people that lived in these places and what they did, what they overcame, is really important to consider. And then the second point is that I think there's often a arrogance and hubris of not just people in Charlotte, not young people, or anything like that. All of us as Americans alive today that think we're the first people to encounter the problems of the time. But that just flat out is not true. And the more you learn about history, the more you learn about Charlotte's history, the more you learn about how different groups and people living in these neighborhoods overcame the problems of their day, the more you can, I find it inspiring that like, hey, they've lived through this, they persevered, and now they've got something to show for it. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that these are not every problem is easy to solve or can be solved or has like a rosy picture to look back on and say, hey, that's the blueprint for solving this. But the more you can have that context and understand that you're not encountering something for the first time, I find some peace in that, really. And it's exciting and inspiring to kind of solve the problems of the day.
Yeah, to your point, it gives you a little bit of reassurance that even if we are facing some very hefty and large challenges as a growing city, hopefully there's a way to kind of solve that just by looking at history. We're sitting here in South Park, which I know has its own kind of more modern history, but is there anything you can share about this area that would be kind of fascinating for the Sharon residents or any of our listeners who are in the South Charlotte area?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about this on the way over here, and I was thinking about the fact that I drove from Uptown past Morrocroft to South Park. And that is me giving the directions of my route to get here. But that's also the story of this place. So just like unpacking that a little bit, the fact that I drove here, like this is not a place that existed when the streetcars were the predominant mode of transportation in Charlotte, which was the case for the vast majority of Charlotte's history, or either walking or taking a streetcar. So Charlotte, until the widespread use of the automobile, was a streetcar town. So that's why Elizabeth and Dilworth were the initial streetcar suburbs and kind of how people got around. So the fact that you now drive to get down to the South Park area is kind of a significant thing to keep in mind in Charlotte's history. You drive down Sharon Road, you go past the Moorcroft development. Moorcroft is named for the Governor Cameron Morrison, who had his estate where he lived after becoming the governor of North Carolina in the 1920s. From, I believe his term was 1921 to 1924. But he was known as the Good Roads Governor. There's a couple signs about him throughout the area. But that was important in not just for the Charlotte and Mecklenburg County story, but for North Carolina as well. So at the time, North Carolina was still the South, the backwoods, kind of known as having dirt roads everywhere. It was very difficult for commerce to happen, going back to that theme in Charlotte, without good roads to transport goods and enable trade and all of that. You had the railroads, but beyond those main arteries, it was very difficult to get through the thick red clay mud of Charlotte. So his program was a massive infrastructure investment in the creation of reliable roads throughout the state of North Carolina. And so that's his legacy. So the idea of driving past his former estate, which is now kind of makes up the majority of kind of this area where we are, kind of the South Park, the Mall, Barclay Downs, Foxcroft, all those areas were part of his initial estate. That's a big part of the story of South Park, was kind of the subdivision of that manor into farmland and then the subsequent development that happened there. And then finally, driving from uptown used to be called downtown. So that was the town. It was uptown Charlotte. And so driving from the place that was the hub, the center of all economic development in the region, to another place with its own designs on becoming a city within a city. And you have the mall, but also other corporate headquarters and other things here outside the mall, not just a retail destination, but a place where people like live, work, play. Folks are fans of saying now, this is a distinct hub of that activity outside of what we now call uptown too. So that kind of becoming a city within a city after being farmland that was developed, after being the estate of this governor who was responsible for roads, which kind of enabled the streetcar suburbs of today, is kind of really, again, to the point about the history being all around us. If you just look like that simple sentence actually of traveling to South Park kind of describes the whole of Charlotte's history.
And it's so funny now because, to your point, it's this mixed use kind of dynamic submarket, bunch of headquarters here, the mall, residential, and now South Park is thinking about what comes next and how do we become more multimodal, which I find so funny given that, roads were a big part of its story and its success here in South Park. And I think that's something a lot of Charlotte's grappling with. It's such an auto-centric city now, even though maybe it didn't start that way with the streetcar suburbs. But now folks are wondering, how do we make this more multimodal and how do we get folks around that don't involve a road, which, again, is so interesting to me. I had to ask, since you're covering neighborhoods and, you know so much about the history of them, do you have a favorite neighborhood in Charlotte?
Oh, no favorites. Can't choose a favorite. I think there's a lot of really fascinating stories. I think I'm fascinated by one of my kind of pet Charlotte neighborhood stories is the idea that Lotta Park in Dilworth used to be a lake and had a casino and boats and was this kind of whitewater center of its day. Is really fascinating to me. I think on the west side, the area around what's now Johnson C. Smith has a fascinating story about the community of post-Reconstruction Black intellectuals and kind of the community that they built that continued through the civil rights era is a fascinating story with national headlines of that have significance from civil rights leaders that argued cases in the Supreme Court, like Julius Chambers and his contemporaries and peers in kind of the leadership of the NAACP and local issues of the time, and kind of having their homes firebombed. That's an open FBI investigation to this day. Like that is the place tells the story of those people. And again, that kind of arc throughout history is really fascinating. And it's really interesting. I think something that is really interesting and why all of these neighborhoods kind of have their own story to tell is there's no single geographic oldest point in Charlotte's history, right? And so because there's no port of Charlotte, or there's no trading post that was set up where all the miners went to get their picks and shovels or anything like that, like might exist in other places, these areas of activity and residences and communities built up at different paces, but kind of in their own distinct way throughout the landscape of Charlotte. And that creates some equally interesting pockets of stories that were told in a way that is really unique in a city of Charlotte's size, I would say. So all of them, can't choose a favorite. Really great stories to tell.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's so hard to pick. And I've lived in a few myself, and I've loved all of them. Elizabeth, Noda, now Commonwealth Park, all kind of close in neighborhoods, all have a cool story to tell and are just really interesting places even today. So I completely get where you're coming from. One of the last questions here, but I just wanted to kind of get your take on this. Do you think Charlotte needs to do a better job preserving its history or even telling its story? You're someone who spent a lot of time kind of researching this stuff and giving us intel that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. But as a city, do we need to do a better job?
I think so. I think I think it goes back to what we were talking about of kind of balancing the scale of the highest and best use, and considering Charlotte is obsessed with identity and obsessed with what's next and obsessed with striving and what can we become and all of that. And I think it's important to understand these stories, be curious about where this city has been and where it came from, and have that be a part of what is weighed in the balance when you're thinking about what should come next. I think a lot of the history and built environment of Charlotte that has been torn down, like maybe it didn't need to stick around, right? But a lot of things, it'd be great if they were still here. And I think recognizing that those things need to be evaluated when thinking about the future is something that if Charlotte wants to kind of continue to grow and make that identity and that soul become more obvious, to do that, having that balanced approach to what should come next is what enables that. So recognizing the history for what it is, being proud of it, and having that be central to what comes next is what it's all about. And I think being curious about the history around us, learning more about it, feeling a responsibility to learn more about it, will all go a long way to making sure that balance is part of the decision-making going forward.
Great. Well, we'll have to see, I guess, if the city decides to do more of that. I know for me, I would personally love to see that. But thank you, John, for taking the time to speak with us today. And Ledger readers, be on the lookout for the Love Thy Neighborhood series that will be coming out every other month.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. For more information about the Charlotte Ledger, visit thecharlotteledger.com. This episode was produced by Lindsay Banks.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.